Good morning, everyone, to those who are in presence here in the UN complex in Nairobi, and to those online, welcome to the Open Dialogue on Gender Equality in the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I am Amelia Arreguin from the Women's Caucus of the UN CBD, and I want to welcome all of you for being gathered here. This morning, we want to discuss one crucial topic, one crucial question: how women and girls' empowerment and equal opportunities and access to rights will ensure the effective implementation of the post-2020 GBF, and thus the achievement of the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. There is a growing awareness and evidence within conservation and development communities of the roles and contributions of women in sustainable resource governance and conservation outcomes. However, there are still limited mechanisms in place to systematically map, collect, and analyze women's and girls' roles and activities regarding biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing. That's why, during the last 4 years, most of these people that you are looking in the panel and with their organizations, they have been raising the attention about how fully and integrate and meaningful integrating a gender perspective into the GBF, this reality could change. And I want all of you to welcome our very special panel. We have from Women for Biodiversity, Shruti Ajit, Program Officer. We have also Benjamin Sachter from the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. We have Christina Egenter from Worldwide Fund for Nature. Carolina Rodriguez from the IIFB, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and ICA Consortium. We have also Ana Di Pancracio representing the CBD Alliance. And we have also Mirna Fernandez from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Welcome, all of you. And to begin the discussion, I will give you 2 questions to think about and to share with our friends from media. First of these is why should women's rights be included in the post-2020 GBF? And knowing that there is a target on gender equality being proposed and supported by many parties here in the negotiations in Nairobi, how could this stand-alone on gender equality target could ensure the full implementation of the post-2020? And answering this, how, and doing also like having this target and the gender elements through the whole GBF, how this could contribute to build synergies with the Rio Conventions, the SDGs, and other MEAs. And first to answer, I will give the floor to Shruti, if you can give your quick answer to this, please.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So quickly responding to Amelia's first question, women have always played a very important role in conservation and protection of biodiversity. And with respect to that, the kind of work I have been doing as a project officer for Women for Biodiversity, we have found that there have been several examples of women-led conservation, community-based conservation and protection of biodiversity globally. Except a lot of these examples are seldom documented or does not come in these forums. And therefore, it is very important that we talk about these examples and highlight the importance of women and girls in these spaces. Apart from that, we also have the role of women in restoration aspects, which is very important from the target 2 point of view. So with that, the documentation aspect is one of the things that I would want to highlight. The second is that as women and girls, they have also, when you talk about biodiversity conservation, it's not just biodiversity conservation. Women and girls have always seen conservation to and have direct linkages to issues of food security, issues of livelihood, and issues of health. And it's a whole-rounded a more integrated approach, where conservation of the biodiversity is linked to the food security of the women in household. And they are therefore also the keepers of traditional knowledge systems, and they are the ones who pass on these knowledge systems from one generation to another. So as holders and keepers of traditional knowledge systems and their linkages to food security, livelihoods, and health, it is very important that we talk about this in a more whole and well-rounded approach. And due to the current, now we talk about, I know that it will take into a philosophical stand, but with the existing systems of patriarchy, there are a lot of men who are, because of that, men have been forced to migrate to cities to look for jobs, leaving women to take care of biodiversity. So there is a sense of feminization of agriculture, feminization in pastoralist processes, and it is linking women more directly to their biodiversity and the ecosystems around them. So with that, therefore, it is important to recognize the role of women and girls in the governance, management, and conservation of biodiversity. And also, finally, just ending it, it's not just this moment, but also linking the aspirations and needs of girls in future to ensure intergenerational equity. We need to have a gender-responsive approach to the larger global biodiversity framework. That's the only way you can talk about things like gender-responsive financing. You talk about monitoring framework, and it has to start right now. And parties need to look at how gender responsiveness can be implemented on ground in this particular sense. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ruti, for these thoughtful comments. Now we are going to proceed with Ana Di Pancracio for the CBD Alliance.
Yes. Thank you, Amelia. Our view as NGO is that is of utmost importance from a perspective of human rights that the post-2020 GBF is gender just and gender transformative. We are demanding for human rights to be at the core, at the heart of the post-2020 GBF, and of course women's rights are human rights, so they have to be in the post-2020 GBF. We know that there is a growing awareness of and evidence of the roles that women and contributions of women in both the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, but they are radically underrepresented in decision-making spaces related not only to biodiversity, but also the certification and climate at all levels. And usually also they are represented as vulnerable groups rather than really actors of change, key actors of change towards achieving truly conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So we know that, and that's something that we highlight from CBD Alliance, and I invite you to read a document that we prepared for this meeting that is called the Ingredients for a Successful Global Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. That is that the Aichi targets were pretty much, except for a few cases, elements in the Aichi targets, blind to human rights, and we cannot let that happen in this post-2020 GBF. So it definitely offers an opportunity to embed human rights within this framework towards 2030 in order to ensure equitable, diverse, inclusive, and just biodiversity action. And in that sense, maybe we can leave it for later for further exchange, but it's very important. We also highlight that in our document to have a standalone target on gender. It would recognize women as key actors and right holders in both conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, but also restoration, like Shruti was highlighting, their full and effective participation to take place in all biodiversity-related planning, policies and implementation, and that these processes are carried out with a gender lens, and also that gender priorities are included within processes that parties will have to take on, for example, like the national biodiversity strategies and plan of actions. And of course, that would also have important funding implications. And finally, if we say, I'm not an expert on the SDG agenda, but of course we are very well aware that it's a standalone target. One of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals focuses on gender, and it's also a cross-cutting issue in the other 16 goals, and there are also indicators that are very useful from the SDGs to incorporate into the post-2020 GBF that has been highlighted by the Women Caucus and also by CBD Alliance. And at the same time, even though the three Rio Conventions are separated, they are, of course, interrelated. They address perhaps the three most important crises that we have in the world currently. And all of them include gender provisions, whether in the text of the convention or in COP decisions that they adopted later on. They also have gender plan of actions, so there are chances for synergy in there as well, in order to integrate gender to tackle climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification. So hopefully this would lead to gender-sensitive policy making with optimal outcomes for the three Rio Conventions and to engage better among the three of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana. And now I will ask Carolina Rodriguez from the IFB, if you can come to the floor and give your reflections.
Thank you. At all. I think my colleagues here are talking about the different impacts or different issues very important for us too. I don't like to repeat this, but I think for the first question, yes, is because more holistic and integral and creative and strategical and wise and environmental voices will be visibilized in the action when this global biodiversity framework be thought for its implementation and be implemented. Why? Because we are in the territory and we need all time to know what happened with our resources for our children, our societies, our communities. Yes, and we need to participate in every spaces, in the local space, in our territories, in the different communities, to decide what is the most, what is the best decision for our people too. And other point is because women from indigenous people and local communities also build links, alliance, networks, around other own occupations that are related to nature environments with social and family environments too. These traditions also related to the transmission of knowledge through language and through walking the territory permanently, apply a harmonious relationship with the territory that must be safeguarded, as well as their biocultural ecosystems. By the other hand, we will have the possibility to continue of building the appropriate road for our societies, of our people and communities, for our children, that our women, like our mothers and grandmothers, were building for their children and sons, who now we are. We must continue this legacy and our cultural heritage. For this reason, we need a goal to reach all sectors related with the biodiversity issue from and mainstream approach to. But at the same time, we are in all targets because affect or impact the families in territory. At the same time, for the second question, all these agreements, for example, the 27 agreements in Rio, or the 17 goals in the sustainable development goals, are working for different women and different men in different moments that leaves the territories, and they discuss in different moments to arrive of these spaces and create this agreement. And now we have this framework, we have this biodiversity framework that we can link and join our necessities in the local territories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for sharing with us the perspective from the local women, from the indigenous perspective. And now we are going to proceed with to hear from another constituency, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, on behalf of Mirna Fernandez. With Mirna.
Thank you, Amelia. And yes, as my fellow panelists have stated, we as the constituencies have been asking for a global biodiversity framework that has rights-based approaches at its core, because otherwise we won't be able to achieve the transformational change that we are so desperately needing to achieve the life in harmony with nature as it's stated in the vision. We are asking for human rights and nature rights which are closely linked and interdependent, but we are asking specifically for mentions about the rights holders that have been historically marginalized from the decision-making processes and the implementation of the environmental policies, which are indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls, and children and youth. So we need these specific mentions on the framework, and especially on the targets, because only if we have these targets with the specific mentions of these rights holders, we will be able to have them translated into indicators, and then we will have the mandate to ask to our governments to report on how they are engaging us effectively into the implementation of the policies. Besides having these specific mentions on the framework, and for gender equality and gender responsiveness to have a specific target, which is target 22, it is very important, and we have been supporting as the youth constituency to have this target 22 recognized and supported since the beginning, because we think this is an issue that deserves separate attention and a dedicated target. Besides the targets, well, on target 21, we also support the central role of IPLCs and special mentions of their land and tenurial rights, which have been neglected in the implementation of various environmental policies, and especially in the implementation of area-based conservation, sadly. As we can see, even nowadays, we can hear very sad news, for example, about what's happening in Tanzania with the Maasai communities that are being evicted from their lands. And we cannot see this happen anymore. That is why we think it is very important to have the rights mentioned on target 3, but also on target 21 at the core. But also for we as the youth community, we need a mention of youth in the target 21, because otherwise we won't be able to ask to be a part of this access to participation, access to information, and access to justice that are core elements of target 21. And that's why we are asking to have a mention of youth at the end of target 21. But well, I spoke about targets. Besides targets, we need these principles of gender responsiveness, gender equality, and intergenerational equity reflected throughout the framework in specific sections when we can push for effective implementation mechanisms. For example, the section BBs that touches on principles for the implementation will be key to guide the implementation of countries. That's why we need strong references and clear references to these principles. Also, when we talk about financing mechanisms, it is very important for us that we also have clear references on how we can enhance direct access to funding schemes for women and girls, indigenous peoples, local communities, and youth, because these funding mechanisms are traditionally very difficult to access for these groups. And most of the times the funding gets lost in the first layers of implementation, like in the development cooperation or in the governments themselves, and the amount of funds that reaches these rights holders is very little or even non-existent. And finally, I think that my colleagues already answered it very well, the question of how to create synergies with the SDGs and multilateral environmental agreements. So only to add, we think that it's very important to also go beyond the SDGs and the MEAs, because we need to enhance synergies with the human rights obligations of the states and have the recognition, for example, of the CEDAW Convention that focuses on the elimination of forms of discriminations against women, and also the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because they are also very related to what we are looking for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirna. And we're going straight with Christina Eigenter from WWF, please.
Thank you, Amelia, and all the panelists before me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and good day to everybody. WWF, as a conservation organization, WWF strongly supports a gender equality target in the GBF, together with the Gender Plan of Action. We think is not only a moral and legal obligation, it's also a smart, efficient, cost-effective, and just way to achieve the three objectives of the convention and to implement the global biodiversity framework. It's interesting that if we ask anybody, role, knowledge, and leadership of women in sustainable use of biodiversity, in conservation of biodiversity, is clear, is probably obvious to everybody. Still, you get a lot of questions about what is the nexus between women and biodiversity? Why is it important to have women highlighted in the global biodiversity framework for biodiversity? And, well, let's try to imagine a world without the women and their contribution to biodiversity, especially think of food security, think of small-scale farmers, farmers, then everybody thinks of men immediately. Thinks of small-scale fisheries. Think of medicinal knowledge for remedies of plants, from plants and other sources. All of that would not be there. So the problem is not that there is no contribution, but the problem that this contribution has been undervalued, has not been recognized, has not been highlighted, has not been properly documented, and especially has not influenced policymaking at local and national level to the extent and scale that should be comparable and adequate to the role that women play in biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. So unfortunately, we know much of this is happening in the informal sector of the economy, while it's a huge contribution to the GDP of a country. And so recognizing and having a separate standalone target on gender equality in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, we think is key to bringing to light the right contribution and the value of women in conserving biodiversity for the future generations, for the present and future generations, I would say. And I think it's our standing on this as a conservation organization is very clear, but I'm very pleased to hear and echo a lot of what my colleague panelists have expressed, and that shows a strong civil society movement and voice in support of this. And we think that as WWF, that gender positive is key to nature positive for a sustainable and equitable development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And now to close this first round of interventions, we're going to have Benjamin from the OHCHR.
Thank you. Greetings. Ben Schachter. I'm from the United Nations Human Rights Office. And I think a lot has already been said, and I don't want to duplicate it. So I'm going to maybe share a few observations, really, instead. One is to think about this panel here and think about how many times you've seen the exact opposite gender balance. How many times you've seen 5 or 6 men and 1 woman, or maybe none. Well, that's part of what we're talking about, really. We need to let people, like those to my left and right, have a space to speak and participate and contribute to these discussions. We absolutely will not have transformative change if we leave behind 50% of the world's population. And that's why, unfortunately, or fortunately, there's an entire apparatus within the human rights system, within the United Nations, numerous instruments that are all pushing and driving toward the same direction, which is achieving gender equality. Now, in a more ideal future, hopefully we won't need these things, but we absolutely need them right now, and we absolutely need a standalone target on gender equality and the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework. And you've heard a lot of good reasons why. I think the simplest explanation is that in far too many places around the world, in far too many spaces, decisions are being made about women without women. And we have to correct that everywhere. So, you know, there are human rights instruments, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. There's a UNEA resolution, 4/17, about gender equality in environmental governance. There's a gender plan of action that's being negotiated. There's the Beijing Platform of Action. There's numerous CEDAW general recommendations, right? There's this entire framework devoted to addressing this critical problem we have, which is entrenched discrimination against women, preventing them from, women and girls and persons of diverse gender identities, preventing them from helping us achieve the transformative change we need. So I think there's a lot else I could have said, and there's a lot I'd be happy to share later. One thing that I do want to share is that OHCHR, UN Environment Program, and UN Women have worked together on some of these issues, and I've got here a copy of our key messages on human rights, the environment, and gender equality. We've also looked extensively at realizing women's rights to land, and I think that's going to be an important part of the discussion going forward. And we have a publication dedicated to that. So there's a lot of information and other things, you know, that can be shared or further discussed. But in the interest of time and hearing more from my colleagues, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Benjamin Schachter, for your intervention. And what we want to do now is to open the floor for questions from you, colleagues from the media. If you want something that the panelists, for the panelists to go deeper, or if you have any other topic that they haven't covered.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Imelda from the Philippines and from the Earth Journalism Network. Is this on? Yeah, okay. As you've said, gender lens is needed in designing programs and policies, but how can we ensure that financial support is needed to make a transformative change, especially on gender?
Someone from the panel want to address it?
I can. I didn't press what one. Okay, thank you for the question. Yes, as I mentioned it before, we need financial support dedicated for women as well as for IPLCs and young people, because most of the times these funding mechanisms don't really reach these communities that are the ones who are going to have the burden of the implementation on them. One way is to have dedicated funds that are going to be directly accessible to these groups, so they don't have to go over several layers of bureaucracy. That is usually the case, for example, for NGOs that have to access funding. So to simplify the application mechanism, the application procedure, for example, because most of the times these women's groups, for example, won't have an NGO constitution, they are not going to have a bank account, or they are not going to have all of the requirements that come with the funding. It would simplify the access for them to funding. Also, something very important is to have gender disaggregated data, especially when it comes to reporting of the funding, so the donors can have to report on how they are having women and girls having being the recipients of the funding. If we don't have gender disaggregated data, they are not going to care, and most of the times the funding is going to reach the men in the communities. And that's something that happens a lot in indigenous communities, indigenous and local communities. I can give you an example. I worked a lot in the Amazon with indigenous peoples and local communities in the Amazon, and we came with an NGO and offered them a lot of different projects, from water and sanitation, education, improvement of the roads, of the schools, and the women in the communities always asked us for handcrafts or making clothes, these kind of things. And we asked them, do you really want a workshop on handcrafts if you don't have access to clean water, for example? And they said, you know what happens is when you have these projects coming to our communities, and we ask for a project, for example, on water and sanitation, the ones that are going to get employed are the men. They are going to get the money from this project. They are going to implement it poorly, so after 2 weeks, the road is going to disappear, or after 2 months, let's say. And then they are going to get drunk with this money, and they are going to beat us. So this money is going to end up in us being beaten. So if you are not going to offer us a project on handcrafts, we better not have any project from you, because the money is going to go to the men. It's not going to be translated into food for our children, into education for our children, anything for our family. So it is very important that funding schemes are totally rephrased in a way that they ensure that it's the women from the communities who are going to get and administrate this money. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirna. And Christina, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mirna. I just add a slightly different perspective to this. I mean, adding, not replacing, which is there is a huge amount of best practices, let's call it that way, initiatives by women, with women, self-empowerment of women at local level, everywhere. But we don't know much about it. And so securing a space and a voice for all these wonderful initiatives is important. Sharing those, not only locally, but nationally and globally through events and fora like this is extremely important. We have also good practices at the level of subnational, national, and sometimes especially subnational government level. I mean, many policies around gender responsive budgets and are being applied, are being implemented, but a lot more needs to be done. But I think let's also see at what can we do in order to show the positive and how much more can be done. Thanks.
Yes.
Maybe just to ask briefly, as you were referring about biodiversity-related planning policies and implementation with a gender lens, it is the MBSAPs, for instance, are a very important instrument in that sense. And at least in my part of the world, countries state parties have not advanced within the framework of developing and implementing the MBSAP to identify how much money they're going to need in order to actually implement that very nice document of MBSAP that they have developed, and in consequence to develop a resource mobilization strategy. And so if they incorporate, if they see that with a gender lens, if they incorporate a gender perspective, not only in identifying how much money they need, but also then in resource mobilization, then we will have funds that go to women. Not only that women and women groups take part in developing the MBSAP, but also that then funds allocated for the implementation of the MBSAP also goes to support women and women's groups. In the case of my country, for instance, Argentina, I think that it's about to start the update of the MBSAP. It has incorporated within the framework of the Commission in charge of developing the MBSAP, the Ministry of Women. So I think they will have a strong voice in order to, among many other things, request that there are funds within that process to support women and women's groups. Thank you.
Sorry, first Carolina and then Ben. Just Carol.
Sorry. Thank you. And I support the position of my colleagues too. And other things is, for example, in our territories, there are a lot of women who likes to increase their enterprises, and how we can support the entrepreneurs, women in the territory with these entrepreneurs related with their traditional knowledge too, and how are they going to finance their proposals related to the connection of nature, not only related to the specific access of other benefits. And the other thing is the woman, the most time, don't have space for participating decision makings in the local territory and in their communities too, are far between them. How to support their strengthening in their territory. They have the women have a lot of ideas and very important ideas to resolve the different environmental issues there, but in these collective spaces it's very difficult to include or recognize that important strategies, and the financial mobilization specifically for women and the different groups in these communities will be very important for the increasing the growing of their self-confidence too there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Ben?
Thank you. First, I really want to second the point about the need for disaggregated data, and we can't make effective decisions without good information, and in fact we're all entitled to that. We have a right to access information, and we have a right to meaningful and informed and effective participation, and that really requires that we have good disaggregated data so we can understand the situations that we're trying to address and craft effective policies with the participation of all of those involved and affected by those policies. On the specific issue of finance, I think that there's a broader picture which is pretty simple, which is that very little finance for environmental action reaches any rights holders. Most finance goes to really large projects. Many of those large projects actually have negative human rights impacts, including displacement of people and other impacts. And there needs to be a lot of work done on making smaller projects with accessible finance a possibility for rights holders across the board, specifically when it comes to the access of women and girls to finance and resources. The key message document I referenced has a message which, if I may take the liberty to just read very quickly, it's to ensure equal ownership of access to and benefits from resources for women and persons with diverse gender identities. The Beijing Platform of Action and the 2030 Agenda and SDG Target 1.4 recognize that women manage and use natural resources in a manner that provides benefit and sustenance to themselves and their families and communities. Discriminatory laws and practices in access to ownership, tenure, and use of resources, including land, water, forests, and supplementary resources such as financing, extension services, tools, seeds, technology, and information, contribute to the disproportionate effect of environmental harm on women, especially Indigenous women, and those living in rural areas. According to a 2011 report by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, if women were given access to productive resources similar to that of men, they could increase their farm yields by 20 to 30%, which could reduce global hunger by 12 to 17%. Gender-related inequities in access to employment, tenure, finance, land, technology, and resources stand in the way of economic progress, ecological preservation and repair, and environmental justice. States should revise or repeal laws and policies that contribute to unequal resource distribution on the basis of gender and take active special measures to ensure equal and just access to and decision-making power over resources for women and persons with diverse gender identities. And so just thank you for humoring me while I read that. I'm sorry it took a little while. But I think the point I wanted to make is that it's not just the finance, it's the entire structure, the legal and policy structure that creates barriers that are inhibiting effective environmental action and the fulfillment of human rights for all people, including women and girls.
So I echo with all my colleagues and friends here who said something about gender financing. And just to add to what is being said regarding the financing, like Ben said, it really gets to, Ben and the others have mentioned that the financing and resources are usually kind of only accessible by major groups. And therefore, to enable that these resources go to local processes, we need to go beyond thinking about resource mobilizations for specific projects, because that then becomes a little tokenistic. It becomes time. It gets stuck to a particular time frame, and then there is very little conversations on the resilience and sustainability of these projects. So resource mobilization, especially like Christina was talking about, so many women-led processes that's happening on ground needs to have access to these resources directly without having these multiple linkages in between. And therefore, there needs to be resources to build capacities to have access to these resources. There needs to be also a kind of a space where you create these dialogues to enable more people locally from grassroots to be able to access these resources, so that it supports the already existing processes that is going on ground, and supplements that work instead of trying to start something new. And just because parties and countries have certain targets they want to do, instead of starting something, looking at already existing examples, already existing processes that are gender responsive, that are gender just, to support those processes on ground. The other point about NDSAPs and including gender financing and gender responsive aspects to NDSAPs is also to look at the NBSAP and their linkages to the national laws and policies focusing on gender. And otherwise, every one of the biggest problems in various countries is that various departments are working in silos. There are no synergies. So it is very important to look at existing legislations, existing policies that talk about gender equality and link that with the NBSAPs when the NBSAPs is being drafted for the next round after COP. That's all.
Well, thank you. My name is Ibrahim. I'm an investigative journalist based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, fellow of Earth Journalism Network. I have two specific questions. My first question is that how are the South Asian women contributing to biodiversity conservation through agriculture? Are they getting any special financial support for their work from government or NGO or from any kind of sources? And do you have any accurate data about this? If they don't get it, how can they be helped? And we want to know about your working plan in this regard. My second question is that have there been any discussion with this GBF working groups on the contribution of women in agriculture and the recognition of women's work in biodiversity conservation? If so, what has been emphasized there? Thank you.
So I guess South Asia, I'll take that. With regards to agriculture, there have been, like I said in my statement, that there has been a general trend of feminization of agriculture as more and more men are migrating to cities for jobs. Therefore, there are a lot more small-scale women farmers who are existing. But there is very little gender disaggregated data available, publicly available, for us to understand how many women farmers are available and how much access to, let's say, incentives and subsidies that the parties or the countries are providing are directly going to women. There is maybe very little or to none that are there with regards to data. So with regards to that, the first step is to ensure, when you are talking about monitoring frameworks, to have that gender disaggregated data to be set up, to enable us to understand how many of these women are actually the ones who needs to be the beneficiaries of the various supports that the state or the country wants to provide. So with regards to that, the first are these monitoring mechanisms, and they're already existing with the SDGs. And it'll be, if we have the target 22, we will have these monitoring mechanisms put in place for countries to start getting that gender disaggregated data. And for the second question, I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't get it. A special plan. So the target 22 will focus on once and therefore the global biodiversity framework, if we have the target 22, that will ensure that we, as globally, we get countries to look at gender disaggregated data, gender responsive and gender budgeting, specifically in their national biodiversity strategic and action plans, so that then, once we have that public data available, civil society and community-based organizations on ground, and also indigenous people and local communities will have that public data available to know how much of that is something that they can access and they have rights towards. So we need to have this target 22 to be able to then ask the countries that you need to implement gender responsive, gender just, gender transformative processes with their existing legislations and policies that they have. So I don't know if I responded to that. Do you have any? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Stella from IPS News and Earth Journalism Network as well. Can you share some numbers with us at this point? We are already on the 4th day. How many times exactly Target 22 has been discussed in the plenary? And what are the main bottlenecks that have come out? We just want to understand. You know, everybody says very aspirational things, very emotional. I believe it's a matter of high emotion. But where are the challenges? Why wouldn't the parties go straight away and just say that, yeah, we do support this? Thank you.
So, with regards to Target 22, which was discussed in one of the contact groups, there have been 22 parties that have so far endorsed and supported this. So, the reason why, I mean, you say it's emotional, but one of the things that is something that we would want to focus on is land rights and tenurial rights. And a lot of people would want to club 21 and 22, but we feel and we need to know that Target 21's, like Meena mentioned, it's specifically for IPLCs, and we need to have a gender equality target, which is focusing specifically on these issues that are coming from ground of no available gender disaggregated data, all of those. So therefore, with taking those into account, there have been a lot of countries who say they have supported the gender equality, the Target 22. And I don't know, Tina, do you want to?
Okay, no. First, sorry, hi, this is Mrinalini Rai. I'm the Director for Women for Biodiversity and also coordinating the Women's Caucus. And yeah, I think first, just the way the process is working here. The Working Group 2020 Session 4 took the opening of the targets 2021-22 for the first time. That means they were not discussed in Geneva, so they've only actually gone through what's called the first reading. So as you know, there are a lot of different contact groups happen. And so the target 22, compared with 2021, has only come to this contact group only once. Right, so we haven't had time to discuss this any further. So you need to know the process of how many times. So this is what we are, and as civil society, what we are trying to do is it is a party-led process. So we are really hoping that with all these, we kind of drive that ambition further in actually realization of the Target 22. So currently, right now, the Target 22 was open for the first time here in contact group on the 22nd. And since then, we are also awaiting what's going to happen next. So our engagement has been 3 minutes in the session. And I would definitely take this opportunity to also say thank all the parties who have this growing support. So again, encouraging that the target for standalone on gender equality is there. Now the discussion around is what that Target 22 will look like. That's the discussion here. How much is going to be aspirational and how much it'll actually be more just and inclusive and transformative the way we want to vision it, that it will help in implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework. So currently there is only one session, so we don't know, again, like you know, today is already Friday, and there are a lot of other discussions happening. So we don't know when or if this Nairobi meeting will have another contact group for us to re-engage with the parties. But having said that, I'm saying that we also have GRULAC as a constituency, regional, the HAC, the High Ambition Coalition support. Now we have the EU as a collective support. We have the UK and the Norway support. We have African countries, Benin, Tanzania, Togo, which other countries I'm forgetting? Yeah, so we had a large, including from Asia, we have Maldives and Philippines also supporting it. So I think there is this growing number. So we don't want to set it up that this is the number, because as you know, CBD is a consensus building, and that's what we're trying to hold, is that hopefully all these work will influence and support the work. So hopefully that's helped a bit of clarification.
Is there any other question from the floor? And this is going to be the last one, so we can keep our answer short, please.
Hi, this is Murad Khan from Pakistan, and here I am from Art Journalism Network. My question is so simple. How much you are hopeful that Target 22 will be a part of GBF, or still you have to do more homework?
To be super brief, as Amelia requested, we are very hopeful, and now Target 22 is there. There was a discussion whether it should be 21 and have women there, but now it has been very clear in the support from many parties that the GBF has to have a standalone target on gender. So we will keep on working on that. There is a long road till Montreal and then the COP, 15 days at COP. But we'll all constituencies here will keep on coordinating and promoting the final adoption on a standalone target on gender equality on the post-2020 GBF. So of course we are very hopeful. If we're not positive, optimistic, we wouldn't be doing this job, believe me. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think that the one discussion, and obviously there have not been enough discussions, but the one discussion that Tina referenced earlier this week went quite well. There was essentially only one party suggesting that targets 21 and 22 be merged, and as Tina mentioned, there were 22 parties, including some representing regional groups, expressing support for a standalone target on gender equality. So I think the issue, or I hope the issue really is more a question of what that looks like, what that target looks like. And the phrasing is important, and there are two different or several different proposals on the table. Those will go through negotiations, and they need to have adequate time to negotiate them to come to a strong outcome. I'd just say that the proposal from Norway is I think an excellent one, and seeing that phrasing would be great, and I maybe just want to share that very quickly if I can pull it up. To ensure gender equality in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the achievement of the 3 objectives of the Convention, including by recognizing equal rights and access to land and natural resources of women and girls, and their meaningful and informed participation in policy and decision-making. So it's really a testament to all the people here and all the people they represent that there is now a new target. And I look forward to seeing that go forward.
Yeah, Christina, maybe that's the last intervention, please.
Oh, put a lot of pressure on me. No, just briefly to remember that we have built a really strong voice as civil society and diverse voices coming together on one issue. And I think this is something to celebrate, but also keep going, because after very hopeful that the gender target will be there at COP, but there is the implementation afterwards, the gender responsive resource mobilization that needs to support such implementation at national and subnational level. Thanks.
Well, we need to come to an end of this dialogue, but we are really thankful for your interest, for being here. And please feel free to reach our panelists, but also our colleague Tina from Women for Biodiversity. And we are still going to be here around, so if you have more questions or you want to go into more detail, we can do. Thank you, everyone, for being here.